Welcome to the Cycling Performance Podcast, presented by Team EF Coaching, where we explore the intersection between the science of sport and the art of balance, human behavior, and sustainable performance on and off the bike. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Cycling Performance Podcast. I am your host, Nathan Haas, Director at Team EF Coaching. And today I have two very, very exciting guests with us. First of all, I would like to introduce Francesca Hall, who is one of the team coaches on Team EF Coaching and professional cyclist herself. She has quite an epic sports science background, which I'll let her talk about. And then we also have Nate Wilson, who is the head coach of Team EF Pro Cycling. So I will ask Frankie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi guys, thanks for having me on. I am a professional rider in the women's peloton and one of the coaches with Team EF Coaching. My journey through cycling actually started from an academic background. I've come into it through the academic route. I started studying at university in Loughborough in the UK. And I started with a maths degree and then went on to a master's in medicinal exercise and physical activity, and then went on to pursue a PhD in physiology, specifically looking at practical applications of blood flow restriction training in elite endurance trained athletes and cyclists.
That's quite a long list of things that you've already done academically, Frankie. But one of the things I actually think is the most interesting come to cycling story of all time is that Frankie was not a cyclist before she entered her academic pathway, and was just inspired by the sport and her love for science and self-testing, which has actually meant that Frankie is all the way to the highest level of the sport. It was set to do the Tour de France this year, but unfortunately had a crash a few months ago, which she's seemingly recovering well from. So Frankie, thanks for joining us on the show. So Nate, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. My name's Nate. I'm the performance director at EF Pro Cycling. My role's evolved a bit over the past 5-6 years. I started with the team in 2019. And now I have kind of a generalist role working across our different performance departments, from medical, nutrition, coaching, equipment. Each of those has its own leader. My role is kind of to try and help that as an ecosystem we work together to achieve the goals of the team and the needs of the riders. My background is a mix of practical and academic. Over the past 10 years, it's way more practical in the field with athletes, with practitioners, with racers, former racers. And my academic background is that I have a degree in physiology, but it's not at a high level, I didn't finish a PhD. I think that I'm very much kind of in a generalist role where I've developed enough of a knowledge of physiology to talk with people that really know a lot about physiology. But I don't consider myself an expert in any real area, just trying to figure out how the different pieces of the puzzle can come together to help athlete performance.
So you're kind of like the Steve Jobs of Team EF Cycling, getting all of the masterminds together to work their best. I love it.
The name to compare to might be the wrong one, but anyways, something like that.
We just need to get you a turtleneck for next team camp.
Yeah.
So that's great. So we wanted to get you on the show with us, specifically for what time of year we're in right now. We're in the Tour de France. So, for any listeners listening to this after the Tour de France, I'm sorry if it's not totally evergreen, but I think the scope of what we want to talk about today applies, for 12 months a year now for what direction training is certainly moving towards in cycling. And the subject, which applies definitely to this year's Tour de France, which has been the hottest on record. I think we've had multiple days which have actually been recorded as the hottest ever Tour de France finishes. The subject is heat training. Seems to be, a little bit of a buzzword in cycling and endurance sport at the moment. And, all three of us have been around science and sport for long enough to know that there's been lots of trends. I can think of a few which, would be, ketones or ice baths or fasted training, fat oxidation maximization. And what's been interesting with, I think, a lot of these, methodologies or stresses to the body is that, whilst they are a fad, it seems that everybody is doing it. And it seems to be the only thing that people actually focus on in that time. And then they seem to tail off, which I think is quite an interesting phenomena because, each of these methodologies has advantages. But I think that occasionally, or more than occasionally, people can see concepts in sports science and training a little bit too myopically. So I'd really like to get into that aspect of the conversation a little bit further on, and as we unpack it a little bit. But I would like to hear your thoughts on what seems to be the biggest fad in training at the moment, Nate, which is heat adaptation training.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. I think the whole topic of fads in general is an interesting one. The ones that come quick and the ones that go quick and how applicable they are aren't. I mean, my first point with heat training is, to me, it's not a fad because heat adaptation protocols have been around for a really long time. They're not that new. The body's physiology of what it needs to adapt to the heat and the mechanistic changes that occur to make you better in the heat haven't changed, and I think have been pretty well established. So I think, like, to some degree for me already, it's not a fad because heat's always a stress that limits performance. The core concepts of how to get better in the heat have been there, but it definitely feels like a fad or a recent resurgence where the presence of that and people using those concepts as tools to improve their performance has just taken off in the last 5 years. I don't know if that's strictly like a general rise in global temperatures because, I mean, summer's always been hot. There's always been, you go to Tour Down Under in January and it's always a huge swing in climate from European winter to Australian summer. So I think, I don't know exactly why it's risen so much in the past 5 years, but I think a big part of it and why it goes in the direction of fad is what has changed in the last 5-10 years is the knowledge around what physiological changes will happen with extended heat protocols, the knowledge around what will happen with combinations of heat and altitude in sequence. So I think we've kind of shifted from, we've got these ways of preparing an athlete for the heat. If it's a hot race, we should do it. To sort of research that's established longer term exposures to a significant enough degree of heat will increase hemoglobin mass to a similar level as altitude, but perhaps you can use it in sequence with altitude where you've gotten a hemoglobin mass increased from doing a block of altitude. You can extend the maintenance of that hemoglobin mass by following it with heat. I think all that is kind of new, maybe a little bit fad-esque, and that just kind of doubles down on, okay, in the past maybe we used it as an isolated tool for really hot races or athletes that really struggled with the heat. Now it feels like there's more evidence to say, like, well, this will just somehow make you faster in a generalized way, in a way that impacts your aerobic physiology. Plus, you see like tools coming out like Core that draw an athlete's attention to the idea that you can monitor it, you can make it more structured, and it just kind of pushes the whole topic forward into something that people want to do.
So I think you just hit on a lot of subjects in that well-crafted sentence. I think the first thing to point out for the listeners is that heat training actually falls under kind of multiple umbrellas. And the first one that you spoke about, which has been studied for actually a very long time, and there's a huge amount of literature on this, which is well understood, which is acclimatizing for the heat so you can perform better in the heat itself. I remember back in 2008, I was actually part of a study with the Australian Institute of Sport, where we were doing some testing specifically on a simulated time trial course from the Beijing time trial. And we were exposed to a similar humidity and temperature in a room for training. And we were actually trialing different pre-cooling methodologies to work out if there was an increased time to critical heat failure point. And what they meant by critical heat failure point, which was by the time you actually get to a body core temperature, which we saw a drop off in performance. They saw this as an inevitable aspect of performance, but they were testing cooling strategies. So cooling strategies is one part of heat training. The other then is, can we train specifically at heat so that we're better at it? Sweat efficiency. And also our nervous system actually adapting to understand this is not as much of a threat. So there's also sort of like a psychophysiological connection to this. But to make the point of what seems to be changed in the last 5 years is the understanding that we can actually create a specific adaptation by doing, as you said, extended time in heat to actually create changes in our body which will upregulate our plasma volume and also to create a change in our hemoglobin. Traditionally, we've always looked at altitude training or high elevation training as a way to do this. But there's a lot of findings into how we can actually simulate this with heat training. So I would love to get your knowledge and understanding, and this is where I think we can even throw you in here, Frankie. What most people actually wouldn't know is that actually our kidneys act as our body's primary oxygen sensors. And when they detect low blood oxygen level, when we're in a state of hypoxia, we have specialized cells, which are called peritubular cells, I think they are, which release the hormone, erythropoietin, which is EPO, into the bloodstream. Then that has a flow-on effect, which signals bone marrow to create more red blood cells, more oxygen carrying capacity overall in the system. So, Nate, would you be able to kind of give us a little bit of a background, and Frankie, for that matter, on how heat training is trying to create the same EPO release as altitude training?
Sure. And also, Frankie, jump in, correct me where I might be wrong, because for sure, like, my in-depth knowledge can be flawed here, but my understanding of it has always been you have this mechanism kind of labeled the crit meter, and like this is stemming from what your hematocrit is, concentration of hemoglobin within your total blood volume, and the body generally wants to maintain a similar concentration of your blood volume. As you get heat exposure, it's not that all adaptations happen at once. They happen kind of in sequence. And this is where this crit meter mechanism is very important. So you start getting heat exposure, whether it's in a natural way or an intervention way. And one of your body's first adaptations is to start increasing plasma volume. Sweating is your best way of cooling yourself. You want to be able to sweat as much as possible to perform better in the heat. Your body starts making more plasma so that you are able to lose more fluid. You can sweat more, you can cool yourself better. Over 14 days, that plasma volume shifts. Now, functionally, you have this hemodilution. Your hematocrit goes down. You haven't lost hemoglobin mass, but the concentration of it within your total blood volume has gone down due to the increase in plasma volume. Then this is where this crit meter that wants to maintain sort of a similar concentration of hemoglobin kicks in and starts upregulating EPO production, because it says, okay, we're actually a little bit dilute on hemoglobin. And now, as long as you continue this sort of level of heat exposure and you're into week 3, 4, 5 of heat exposure, you're now having this increased hemoglobin mass production, trying to catch up to compensate the sort of initial plasma volume bump. So the main thing is heat can increase your hemoglobin mass the way altitude does, but it happens in sequence, and the time course of those things are a bit different. Like I think if you went to 2 weeks of altitude and got a sufficient hypoxic dose with sufficient energy availability, the evidence is you should have an increase in hemoglobin mass. If you had 2 weeks of heat exposure, you might not yet have an increase of hemoglobin mass. You might be just getting to the point where that crypt meter function is starting to kick off an increased erythropoiesis.
And I think that's a really interesting point to highlight the differences between heat and altitude, because when I first came into learning about these kind of, I won't call it an ergogen, it's an environmental training aid or environmental training stimulus, be that for acclimation, which is the process of getting used to this environmental stimulus, be that heat, altitude, cold as well. For me, I would have to go and acclimate to racing in Belgium before I would have to go and acclimate to the Vuelta at 40 degrees or whatever. And adaptation, and it depends on what the total goal is. Are you wanting to go and race? For a lot of our clientele within the Team EF structure, are you wanting to go and race, for example, Ironman Nice this weekend just gone, or one of the Grand Fondos in August where it's really hot, and you acclimating to be able to perform in that? Or are you introducing heat training to bring about an adaptation to improve your performance at a temperate condition? And that is, the main difference is heat, as Nate correctly explained, it brings about a similar adaptation if you are there for 4 or 6, potentially even longer weeks with a long, slow exposure to heat that doesn't impact your ability to complete your regular training. So everything else has to be nailed. You can't really be adding altitude stimulus unless you're in a physiological position to handle that. For example, if you head up to Sierra Nevada in August, you are in a pressure cooker, because not only are you living at 2,500 meters, you are training every day, riding really slow uphill with minimal wind cooling aids, probably 2 hours a day at least. You are climbing from the bottom of that mountain to the top in 40 degrees, direct heat exposure, no real wind cooling, and you're riding at altitude. That is going to dampen your ability to perform the key sessions that you need to maintain general training. And altitude, as you said, with the heat, it just increases that blood plasma volume, which basically means you have, for a very general explanation, heat training works by allowing you to cool more efficiently, and you sweat more. And the goal of it is to kind of sweat earlier at a lower core body temperature, so your body stays cooler for longer. And with heat adaptation, you have this higher blood plasma volume, which, as you said, is purely a higher amount of water in your blood. You're not having any more. You haven't got increased red blood cell mass. You haven't initially got a higher hematocrit level, but you have more water for a similar amount of sodium concentration. So you are able to sweat earlier and sweat more water, which allows more water to be evaporated from your skin, which is the inevitable cooling mechanism. So it's a really interesting thing, is how can you use heat versus altitude, and practically for a lot of people, as I said, it was described to me as the poor man's altitude, because it's much more feasible to integrate into everyday training for the majority of athletes. You can, if you're like Nathan and I'm not too sure where you're based, Nate, but if you're like Nathan and I, and at the moment you wake up and if you want to head out before work, it's already 28 degrees and it's what feels like it's about to rain because of the humidity, head out in the middle of the day, you're close to 40 degrees, or you do what I'm doing currently due to injury constraints. And like for the last 3 days, I've sat on the trainer in my apartment, turned off AC, turned off the dehumidifier, and just seen how low can my power be for any given heart rate because of how hot and humid it is, and how much sweat am I losing. And I track my sweat loss and just geeky stuff, track my sweat loss. And actually I've been monitoring the sodium concentration in my sweat, and I've just done 10 days back. I'm in my first 10 days of training, riding again, and even from day 1 to day 10, my sodium concentration has dropped from about 1400 mgs down to below 1000 mgs per liter, and that is my body adapting to that humidity and being able to cool myself earlier and quicker, sweating more. And people can do it. They can go and sit in their bathroom, they can put all their winter kit on their trainer. All you need to do is like a 30-40 minute session, and you might have more advanced protocols, but the simplicity of it is, safety wise, don't get too hot. You need to recognize the symptoms of overheating, because it obviously can be very dangerous, especially if you're training on your own and you're not in and around somebody. But you essentially need to get hot and stay hot and reduce the intensity of your ride to prolong that duration at that really, what I like to describe as threshold sensation, but it's a threshold to heat tolerance. It's not a threshold power wise. Your power should be way, way, way below anything remotely threshold, but it's accessible for everyone, and it can do a lot. For the literature, as you said, is well understood, it's well stated, there's a lot of equivocal evidence there that says it does benefit people in hot and cold performance.
Yeah, Frankie, I would say that's wonderfully described, which leads me to my main objection currently to heat training for everybody. And I guess I could tie this into context, which is I personally have a few clients who have gone out and bought core training suits and not told me that they were doing some heat acclimatization training. They tell me 1 to 2 weeks afterwards, and then I see what session they were doing that in, and my sort of question marks over what were happening in those sessions all make sense. The biggest issue, I think, is that there is a general understanding in that heat training is specifically to induce an effect in the body, as opposed to actually trying to create power on the day, what would be prescribed for a regular session if you were outdoors. But a lot of riders, they'll sit at 240 or 260 watts for the duration of the session, not knowing that actually most of the protocols sit way, way, way below that. So the question is, without the right education and the right protocols, can athletes be doing themselves damage? Can this be dangerous? I would argue absolutely. And can it have, even if they're not, critical dangers for everybody, can they have, minor dangers for you? And I would argue again, yes. I was recently made aware of a great expression about the nervous system, is that actually the muscles are a slave to the nervous system. So when people are trying to essentially, build muscle mass or lean muscle mass, by doing high power during a heat training session, they're actually sort of, kicking themselves in the face, because what's happening is that your sympathetic nervous system is having such an intense threat that the safety mechanism, which is saying, I'm not actually going to let you push much harder for a while because I'm currently in shock and I'm sensing that there could be a really dangerous threat just around the corner. So when you actually get back outdoors and you're expecting to have this huge boost in power because of, the effects that you're getting from heat training, that's going to be completely undone or even underwritten by the fact that your central nervous system is just telling you that you are still in danger, even though you're cool, you're healthy, your electrolyte balance is fine. It can take a long time once we put a severe threat into the nervous system to fully recover. So Nate and Frankie, I would love to hear from you just before we jump into any kind of protocol suggestion or description, what you see as the dangers to the body and to the system for doing heat training without healthy and well understood protocols.
Yeah, no, I think the point as you described it is totally the right one. I mean, you can definitely harm yourself, like first from a health level, second from a performance level, and third from just sort of a fatigue level, taken to the most extreme degrees. Like you said, I mean, you could hospitalize yourself or something, like extreme dehydration or heat exhaustion. I think a lot of athletes that are super motivated and think that if you're doing something, you should just do it as hard as you can. It's easy to miss the fact that, like, you actually really could damage yourself in a relatively short period. Like you could really damage yourself within an hour, of taking it too far, impacting performance in a negative way. I think that sort of CNS concern that you brought up is a really good one. Where it's like you create this stimulus because you think it's going to let you do more, but if you take it too far, your body just isn't going to want to go there. So it doesn't really work. And then the third is, I think, you have it in heat, but you have it in all types of training. Like, something that can be good can turn bad because, like, too much just turns to fatigue, and fatigue outweighs adaptation. And, like, it doesn't matter how much.
It's the classic athletic mindset, which is some is good, more is better, right?
Exactly. And I think it's exactly like you were saying, Frankie, of like, the goal isn't just to heat yourself up as much as you can. It's actually more staying within thresholds. A good analogy. Like, if you're doing threshold training and you're hoping to get an aerobic adaptation that helps you sustain power for longer, even if you can do more watts, it's not better. You're actually going to change the stimulus and actually miss the adaptation that maybe that kind of training is trying to achieve. I think in some ways the heat training is kind of the same. Like, you want to be hot enough to create a stimulus without being so hot that you're kind of creating damage or missing the point. So I think some degree of precision is needed. And the challenging thing is that precision is maybe, it needs a little bit more education around it than just power zones or heart rate zones, because it's something a little different. Heart rate's a good tool, but like, you really need something that's telling you about your internal stress.
Yeah, and I would the only thing I would probably add to that danger wise, outside of physical and CNS danger, and like you said, this is the dehydration element of it, and that's actually one of the main things that you need to, for this to be effective, is one of the main things you need to nail is the rehydration kind of during and post training. But linked to that is it's essentially it's a stressor, a training stress, to use a terminology that a lot of people are aware with. It's added TSS. It's the total load adds to your total load the same way that working 70 hours a week adds to your total load. No sleep adds to your total load. Family illness adds to your total load. Heat is an entirely additional load onto whatever training you are doing on the bike. It's almost not doubling, but you could think of it as multiplying your current training load by X amount, purely because you are doing the same training in the heat versus your temperate conditions, and the danger of just absolutely overcooking yourself despite it not being any harder training on paper. Like you said, if you've got clients that are doing your prescribed sessions, but they've whacked a paint suit on something to bring about increased sweating, increased thermo sensations, you're adding load and you're not going to recover as well. You're not going to the flow of training that you've been prescribed, and the load sequencing and the time for adaptation to specific sessions isn't going to be as intended. So you're not going to adapt. You're not going to be able to hit, okay, maybe for 1 week you could hit the prescribed numbers, but you're not going to recover and adapt to what you're doing. And you're not going to be able to, we all know that there is no perfect session, there is no hero game, there is no nothing. The real basis and most simple way to improve performance is consistency, sustainability, and stacking bricks. I like to describe to people who say, oh, you sent me this power and I could do more, so I did do more. I'm like, look, we're not looking at today, we're looking at stacking bricks, and we're looking at stacking bricks day on day on day, week on week, month on month, year on year. And that's how you get to be the best that you can be, is that consistency. And if you start overcooking something by 0.25% every day, what's that exponentially at the end of 3 weeks? You're going to put yourself in a hole and then wonder why you've not made any benefit from all of this additional training that you've been doing. So yeah, you have get it very slightly wrong, and you have a very big scope to mess things up.
Totally.
Long term.
I think, again, Frankie, that was very well said. I'm going to contradict myself in this statement, which I like to do. I like to have double standards so I can have everything. But, I think one of the biggest issues I find with training, coaching, and sports science at this, at this point, I think is the fact that we're becoming very much slave to data and slave to numbers all the time. Which is to say that, because we can measure it, there's an expression, if you measure it, it improves. Well, that's true to a certain extent until we start doing the wrong thing for too long. So, we might be stacking bricks, but not putting the mortar down. And the mortar in between the bricks, I would use in this metaphor analogy as recovery. You brought up the concept of global stress. Everything causes stress in our life, whether that's relationships, financial, travel, work, and then we've got training on top of that. And then what most people also don't realize is that almost every recovery methodology is actually also a type of stress to induce a recovery response. But if we are let's take ice baths for an example. We do ice baths as a recovery methodology, but it's also a huge stress to the nervous system as we're doing it. So there's a good time and a bad time for an ice bath. The way I kind of like to look at global stress is like, we've got a cup that can go from 0 to 100. If all of your global stresses are already at 80, training's taken it right up to 99, then we actually don't have the capacity to put down the mortar between those bricks. So at that point, there would be no need to add heat stress training because it's actually too much of a stress to the body. And this is where I think, in a way, heat training is going to become a little bit of a fad for, I would say, more aspiring athletes as opposed to just the professional athletes, because what we should be focusing on in that limited amount of global stress that we have, because, professional athletes don't have full-time jobs. They're not commuting to work. The job by very definition is just to focus on cycling and what makes that better, so that they do have more global range to do all of these different methodologies. I think it could become a bit of a fad, and I hope that a lot of coaches start encouraging athletes to not focus on things that can give a few percent when we still need to work on the fundamentals, which is just layering those bricks on top of each other for a long, sustained period of time. Where I'm going to contradict myself here, though, is where I think data is very important in this equation, is what Nate was talking about, is how we're actually monitoring the internal response. I think, what you're doing, reading heart rate, this is an internal response, but it can be delayed, and it can also be affected by HRV status, fatigue status, injury status. Also
to throw in there hormonal, where you are as a female, where are you in your hormone cycle? Your
Correct.
temperature can vary by like half a degree a day. So
correct. Yeah, well said, and thanks for adding that in, Frankie. It's a really important and not trivial point to make. So Nate, I would love to hear your thoughts on the importance, which also might lead us into the protocol side of the conversation, the importance of monitoring core body temperature whilst performing heat training.
Yeah, I think it is important. I mean, the challenging thing is sort of the lab grade gold standard is a pill that you swallow and you're literally measuring core temperature. I think there we can be pretty confident. The applicability of that to amateur athletes, even to our athletes, as like a tool to use in remote settings where you want to prescribe heat training and have some feedback is super low. So
it's also a bit of a shitty job to recollect
yeah.
them and clean them and then decide to swallow it again.
Yeah. There's also dangers
Nice
to them
play
as
on
well.
words there.
You know? Yeah. Like you don't want to, if you crash, it can be dangerous. You can't get an MRI while you have one in and all this and that. So it's like the best way of doing it is pretty much a bad way of doing it in our world. That's great for like establishing a protocol at one time and then applying it out, but it's not sort of a great ongoing tool for us. So then basically we use tools that to some degree extrapolate or correlate to core temperature, which is core temperature would be what you really want to know, but there's not a great way of directly measuring it. So the core device is a tool for us. Just very easy, sits on the outside of your skin, uses your heart rate monitor as part of the data input to their algorithm, and extrapolates core temp from that. Also measures skin temp. Together, it has its own proprietary heat strain index that accounts for both skin temp and core temp in varying amounts. I think that's a good concept because you might have some conditions where you have a big skin temp response but a lower core temp response, but the combination of those two still creates a sufficient load. So I think that's something that's new and evolving, but that's something that they're taking a stab at trying to shore up the knowledge behind and make a tool that portrays that. The other one that we've used a lot is just very simple in-ear temperature, working off. There's been some research done to show like a certain brand of ear thermometer reading pretty consistently half a degree lower than a pill thermometer. You're obviously taking temperature at a farther point, so it makes sense that it's a little bit cooler. But the risk is, I guess, this can vary brand to brand. Some brands read higher, some brands read lower. So it's definitely imperfect, but kind of in conjunction with heart rate, in conjunction with RPE, you get like one more measure of internal stress. So we'll use either the core sensor or the in-ear thermometer or both together as like a monitoring tool for actually executing a heat session. Because going back to your guys' point about not overdoing it, if you don't want an athlete to overdo it, I think it's really hard to just say, I don't want you to overdo it. You need to be moderate. Like those are just abstractions. You need to somehow give them a numerical limit that they can take action on, and with the core sensor or with the in-ear temperature, you can just set a limit and here's the target. As you heat up, actually your mechanical output is probably going to be going down to maintain the same internal stress. So I want you to focus more on the internal feedback and then you just adjust power accordingly. It's very hard to say like the power you should execute this session is 220 watts because that's relying on so many variables like the temperature of the room, their hydration status, how adapted they are to heat, which is changing over a 7-14 day period. So the point is like the mechanical output to achieve the same internal response is going to be this ever-moving target. So I think it makes a lot more sense to try and prescribe sessions with some limit that's reflecting the internal status quo, not the external output.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think that this is where people get misled, is that they think that you need to kind of keep layering that power on top. And I think that that's where the damage is done, is where people try to sustain a power as opposed to get to the upper limit of the temperature that they would ideally be at to promote these changes within the body. And then the power goes down according to that. So actually your new meter is actually a heat meter, and the power is actually irrelevant as long as you're maintaining time at that
I think
heat.
that's exactly it. It's like knowing in different training sessions, like what's actually your signal to react to, you know. In a lot of training sessions, it might be power, and heart rate's the response that tells you afterwards how hard you were working to achieve that power. In other sessions, it's heart rate. In this sort of session, it's something reflective of your body temperature. So
And
it's like you have one signal, and everything else is sort of tells you something about it. Sorry, Frankie.
No. I would go one step further to simplify that as your kind of, if we describe them as like, what's your fixed parameter in the session, I'd simplify it even one step further, that RPE should be your fixed parameter. You do, leading into a short protocol example, it could be that you do a 15-minute ramp to reach a 7 to 8 out of 10 RPE, and look at where that heart rate, the coach or physiologist with you will have a rough idea of what they want that power or heart rate to reach, to ramp up and reach it. And then you pin the sensation at about 6 or 7 RPE, and you just look at what happens to your heart rate, what happens to your power, how much are you dropping your power to keep that relative perceived exertion, and is your heart rate then staying stable as that? Because like you said, the it's really hard unless you have kind of a rectal probe or a core body temp pill. It's really hard to know what the exact internal temperature is and what that individual athlete's limit is. Like, how hot can they sit at 39.5 for an hour and it not tip them over the edge, or is 39, like, what is their limit? And unfortunately, which with professional athletes, it's probably the hardest thing to extract from an athlete, is how much are you suffering? Because 9 out of 10 will say, oh, it's not that bad, or well, like you said, more is more. So the more I'm suffering, the better gains I'm getting. Just put your head down and get on with it. But I think RPE in a heat session is a really, really important metric.
I see Nate agreeing and disagreeing with that.
No, I really agree. Like, I think that, like, it's the RPE thing is so valuable and so individual, because I think it's exactly like you said. Like, my experience is you kind of need to normalize everyone's scale to themselves, because one person's 5 is another 8. You know, like, we have a lot of athletes that put each training session or each race day like a very simple 1 to 10 RPE. And some people, they're almost never above a 7. You know, it can be Liège, Bastogne-Liège. They got, you know, they finished top 20 and it was a 7. And other people, it's like, you know, everything's a 8 or above, you know, but you see a lot of 10s if it's really hard, and you see a lot of 8s if it's moderate. So it's sort of like, I think you really need to normalize that for a person. I would think agree. It's a great tool.
I definitely think RPE is like one of the least referred to metrics. And it's, you know, it's often how I actually begin all conversations with my athletes, is before talking about power, is like, how did you feel before the session? How did you feel during the session? And how do you feel after the session? And I don't mean necessarily physically, I mean general affective state. And this is where I think RPE, again, you know, I'm coming with some contradictions here. RPE is also dependent on multiple things. You know, if you're in a great point in life, or, you know, you've got a lot of confidence running into an event, you know, RPE can generally be lower. Like you said, you know, a 7 out of 10 coming into Liège and you've been top 20. That's an oxymoron, because, you know, I've finished Liège multiple times and the next day I can almost not walk because the damage is so profound. You know, maybe if you're Tadek, you know, generally he could be winning with a 7 out of 10 RPE, but not everyone is Tadek. So I think RPE is like a really good guide and almost like overarching concept, because if you're looking at your body temperature and it's only gotten up to 38, but it's like 10 out of 10, that also might be a signal to say, don't do heat training today. Like your general stress is too high. Because it's also a really important thing that athletes can recognize when a prescribed session is given by their coach, when it's actually not the day to do it. And this is like an important feedback, is that the coach is, at best, we're working from a lot of different variables to try to control an outcome. But the one thing that we can't experience is the intra experience of the athlete themselves. So RPE is kind of like the holy guide above everything. An easy session should never feel like a 10. And a 10 out of 10 session should rarely feel easy. It might mean that we need to change the stimulus. But I think that there is an overlay of all of these things together, is that, getting a baseline of what your RPE can generally feel like when we're doing the session, right, to that 39.5 degree threshold that works for that athlete, or 39 for another. I think you can layer in the data on top of RPE, and that's when you can really come in with an educated session from not only the coach, but also how the athlete is feeling during it and how they should feel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Nate, can I squeeze out a little bit of secret sauce for our listeners who probably have been listening to this whole thing waiting to find out what kind of a session they should be doing for heat training? Generally speaking, how many weeks should they be doing it for? How many times a week? And what kind of a session would someone look to do if they were to integrate this into their training?
Yeah. No, easy. We apply heat training in a few ways, depending also on the context of what the environment around them has been. If we want to apply heat training to get an adaptation to the heat, we feel they need a minimum of 6 days of specific heat training uninterrupted. I think that's an easy misconception that 6 days in a 10-day period might get you the same adaptation as 6 days straight block. Our philosophy is it won't, that you need this 6 days straight block, then you could have some interruptions and build on it from there. But 6 being kind of the minimum, 7 to 8 going to come in with a stronger level of heat adaptation. By the time you get to 10, 12, 14 days, I think you're starting to plateau out on some of those initial mechanistic changes of plasma volume, reduction in sweat sodium loss, increase in sweat rate, increase in temperature of sweat onset. So we try and apply a heat training session 6 days in a row. We use active or passive, and it doesn't need to be one or the other. We can, depending on the logistics or athlete preferences, we might do all passive, which would be hot bathing, or we might do all active, which would be indoor riding, overdressed, trying to make a warm environment and using that in-ear temperature or the core sensor as the feedback to guide the session. So our active sessions, we aim for an hour, with the idea that often you're spending the first 10 to 20 minutes kind of getting the body to temp, kind of getting close to that 38.5, 39 temperature, a little bit lower if we're going off ear temp, right about there if we're going off the core temp. And then hold there for 40 minutes. So it's basically an hour total session plus minus. And if we're doing hot bathing, we use same ear temp as a monitor of the internal load, so we know how long it took an athlete to reach temperature. And then we actually use just a bath thermometer to try and control the water temperature at 40, 41 degrees. And the instruction is basically in the bath, kind of up to your neck as much as possible, like kind of full submersion. And both these sessions, we want the athletes to try and actually stay well hydrated. The goal is raising temperature, but not having dehydration. But it's really important not to hydrate with cold liquids. So it's just room temperature or kind of lukewarm liquids. So yeah, we'll basically use an active session or a passive session daily for 6 days. that's sort of our initial heat adaptation. Some periods we might stretch it out for a longer block if we feel like this is an athlete that really struggles in the heat. They seem to need more stimulus. We might try and do a longer block. We might try and do more frequent blocks where it's like, let's do a 6-day block every week or every 4 weeks, for a multi-month period building up to the summer. That's kind of a tool we've used to avoid that sort of initial onset when temperatures go up of just struggling. And then when we've used it in conjunction to altitude, then it's different. I think the evidence is 3 days a week of heat stimulus, which don't need to be consecutive days. It could be a Monday, Thursday, Sunday kind of thing, if that's where it fits the logistics. That's sufficient to maintain hemoglobin mass for an extended 3 weeks after an initial block of altitude. But then you need to own it as you're expecting a different outcome. You're not doing that necessarily expecting a great heat adaptation, and you probably won't get one. You're doing that for the maintenance of hemoglobin mass as a sequence tool with altitude.
That's super interesting. It leads to probably one of my final questions from myself, which is I read an article recently where you were interviewed and you spoke about how you're trying to have a greater understanding of the load from heat training due to natural exposure versus exposure that we're actually creating in either on the bike or, as you said, passively in the bath. So can you give us sort of like cliff notes on what you see as the issue? Because I was recently speaking to an athlete here in Girona, and it's been like 40 degrees, and they're not necessarily training at 7 a.m. to beat the heat. They're actually going out in the heat, and then additionally in the evening they're doing a heat training session for that hour on the bike. And to me, it was sort of, I saw this as a bit of a common sense issue, which is to say, are we getting the minimum effective dose to create these changes, or are we overdoing it and potentially risking other negative, cascade effects here? So how do you see it, and how do you try to account for it?
I think that's exactly it. I mean, it's maybe more of a coaching question, less of a heat specific question. And I'm sure there's varying philosophies around it, but I think it's a stress, right? And going back to your analogy of a cup, that no matter how motivated you are, if you pour more liquid in the cup than the volume in the cup, it will overflow. And if it overflows, you can't drink any of it, right? So it's useless. And now you have a mess to clean up because it's on the floor or whatever. So if you add stress and you don't want to overflow, and heat's a stress, you need to take something away, right? So like, a lot of times when we add heat, we actually take intensity away. We do a 6-day block of heat, we greatly reduce the intensity of that training. We won't necessarily greatly reduce the total volume of the block, but it's really low intensity. That seems to work. But the trade-off is then you're like giving up the stimulus of intensity. If you need to be good in the heat, that's probably a worthwhile trade-off, because the power loss to being poorly adapted to the heat is going to greatly outweigh sort of the few extra percent you might have gained by having a little higher intensity. But that's not the case all the time, right? So it's like, I think you have to be looking for like the net positive out of the sum of stressors you apply. So it's like, is adding heat stress and then whatever you need to sacrifice to compensate for that stress actually leading to a net positive? Or does the sacrifice mean we have to reduce the intensity so much, or reduce the training load so much, that actually like you're going to be slower, not faster, in whatever your key event is? So I think like we don't have a great way of quantifying or tracking that load, especially because I think the way of correctly quantifying that load isn't static. Take like TSS as an example. Every time you do an hour at X power, you get the same TSS. It's constant. You could develop that kind of model for heat, and I think that would at least be a start. But the reality is the stress of that is changing as you adapt, and the amount of stress you can absorb is probably changing as you can adapt. So I think like a model that really well reflects the internal reality of the fatigue impact to an athlete, that's probably harder, maybe conceptually easy, but hard to get right. That's a place like I'd love to see us as a team in the world of sports science develop over the next few years, is like load tracking models that do a better job of putting the total sum of stressors that a lot of people are using now, whether it's altitude or heat or calorie deficits or calorie surpluses or intensity, onto like one scale that just kind of makes sense. I think that's like something that is needed. But yeah, we definitely view it as a stress that needs to be compensated with a sacrifice of some other aspect of load. And then the important question is, will that sacrifice of load plus the input of heat stress equate to a net positive outcome? Or are we just doing something because we think we should, but it doesn't actually make sense in this context?
I think that's a great way of expressing the issue when it comes to global load, right, or global stress. I've not necessarily thought about it in the same way. I think a lot of the time we always think in like additional theory, but sometimes the easiest thing to do is actually subtractive theory as well, is to take something away, which is not always in the athletic mindset. A lot of athletes always just think that they can handle more, and this is like the David Goggins effect. It's like you just need to be harder. You need to be like a Navy SEAL. But
Yeah,
actually,
and it's
so far
sometimes one of
beyond
my
that.
weaknesses. Like I'm definitely on the more conservative side, and I probably work more quickly to the what do we need to take away to add this, rather than, because there's also a very good argument for the contrary of that, of like athletes that are motivated, willing to take care of themselves off the bike, set up their lifestyle in a good way. A lot of times the ceiling of what you can positively respond to is higher than what you might think it is. The question then is, how long can you sustain that period of increased stress, right? Because it's not a constant. It's not like you can do 10 hours a week every week, and as soon as you do 12 once, it's too much. It's like you can do 10 hours a week a lot of times, but you can also do 15 hours a week a few times, which actually is going to be a positive. Done too many times, it'll become a negative. But where's that tipping point? So I think it's not that something always needs to be taken away. It can be like we can sustain a period of increased stress for a certain period of time, but then I'd argue you still need to take something away, because I think the key point is knowing you're in a period of increased stress and saying, okay, we're not compensating by taking something away this week, but we are compensating by putting in a little bit of rest the following week or something. Because like we're going to increase the stress, we expect an adaptation to occur. To allow an adaptation to occur, we need to give the body space to do that. But yeah, I'm conservative. I'm boring. Some people are more aggressive, and that's cool. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Frankie will agree when we say this. Our philosophy at Team EF Coaching is that everything is built first on a pillar of health. So we always try to see things conservatively, and sort of like zooming out at the bigger picture, the longer journey towards fitness, is that we just never want to jeopardize health. Professional athletes, again, by definition, have a better support structure to be able to monitor these things. Team doctors, coaches, and just the environment also having the soigneurs, meals planned for them. I mean, riders don't even have to do their washing, so they can just sit back and recover. So we always err on the side of being a little bit more conservative, which at times, new athletes on our system sometimes, can express that they want to do more. And I understand that, it's in the nature of athletes, type A personalities, that they want to go, go, go. And it's our job as coaches is to actually try to educate them on the why behind doing less is actually more important. So I resonate a lot with that. And it's also really nice to hear that, at the world tour level, at the highest level, there's a similar philosophy, in that, the bigger picture is always the most important.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, it's easy to lose track of the main goal, which is just show up at a race and go fast. And like, there's a lot of options and tools you could apply to an athlete, and there's more options than ever. And I think there's always that fear of missing out of like, well, if I don't do this and I don't do that, will it be the best I can be? But the tricky thing too is, I mean, it's like crossing a river on rocks or something. Like, if you've got three big rocks that you could just easily walk across, but you think like, well, will that be as cool, or will I like see the same view as if I go on like these 20 different little rocks? You're kind of trading off like magnitudes of impact. I think like it's better to pick a few things that you think are highly related to your event and high confidence and just do them really well. And as soon as you fall into that kind of fear of missing out of like, well, won't altitude help me a little, and won't bicarb help me a little, and won't heat help me a little, and won't VO2 training and threshold training, is like how that whole picture comes together. There's just such a risk that like you're not going to get great benefit out of any of those things, because how they fit together becomes a lot more complicated. So I think like if you want to do complicated things, you're kind of decreasing your chance of positive outcome.
I like it. I think the magnitude of impact, I think, might become the title of the podcast. I think that's brilliant. I just wanted to throw out a couple of the questions from some people that sent in questions on Instagram. Quite a few of them we've actually already covered. You know, like, what do you think about the accuracy of core sensors would you recommend using? It seems to me that the overall outcome is to say, yes, absolutely, it's a good idea. The accuracy, questionable, and that RPE and heart rate need to be overlaid to make a more educated decision. Is the core body temperature, is the core body temp sensor worth the investment?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I mean, I think everyone has to decide for themselves what's worth the investment. I think that we've had great success using in-ear temperature to monitor heat protocols, and that's certainly lower cost. You miss a lot of data that you might get from just going out training in the field in hot weather. That's where the core really fills in the gaps for us, is to your point. You're training in Spain, it's really hot. How much heat stimulus are or aren't you getting? Putting a ear thermometer in every 5 minutes isn't really applicable there. So I think it depends a bit what you want to achieve and where you feel your knowledge gaps are. The core sensor could be really useful in filling in some gaps for you, or it could be that it's not needed to make that investment. As to the accuracy of it, I think it's a good product. The important thing is to view it as what it is an extrapolation of core temp. It's not a direct measure of core temp. I think it works very well. Like any device, it can have error. I think 5-7 years ago, it was established that it was slow to react compared to a pill temperature thermometer. That can be a little bit dangerous. They've updated the algorithm. I think that's less of an issue now. But the point is more, I think it's a great tool used in conjunction with RPE, used in conjunction with heart rate. And if you see things really misaligned, have a low threshold at which you're willing to not trust a sensor, because like it's an extrapolation, like it can be error prone. Just like you said, have a bit of common sense about it.
Cool. And the last question, what's the difference in the effect of heat training indoors versus outdoors? For example, in the heat wave. I think we've mostly covered that.
Yeah, I would say nothing if you achieve the same internal response. The tricky thing is, I think in the training in hot temperatures outdoors, you might think you're achieving the same internal response, and in reality you aren't. Or you're getting into that heat zone for 5 minutes, but then you're going downhill and you're actually cooling off, even though it is still hot. You're kind of cooling off enough that you're kind of in and out of that zone. And then the adaptation to that is definitely going to be different compared to just 40-45 minutes straight block, your body temp being held at kind of 38, 39 centigrade. So I think Yeah, the short answer is there's no difference if you can get the same internal response. The challenge is you might think you are and you're not. But if you're on a long climb and it's hot out, you'll definitely more or less get a sustained heat stimulus.
That's great. So, Frankie, did you have any more questions or comments?
I don't think so, other than, yeah, I was just gonna kind of summarize up by my only input to people listening who might want to introduce heat training is just, yeah, as we've mentioned before, potentially start with passive stuff. And some really easy practical things could be as soon as you get back from your ride, where your core body temp is already slightly elevated, just naturally from training and your muscles working, your cardiovascular system, then jump in the shower straight away and sit there for 15-20 minutes. If you have the luxury of a sauna or a jacuzzi, jump in that straight after your ride. You don't have to go to some like massive extremes of buying things or setting up different things. Lie in your bath for 15 minutes as soon as you get back from your ride, and make sure you're kind of lying in the bath with your wrists under, your ankles under, all the points that you'd immediately want to run under cold water if you get too hot. And make sure that if you're wanting to look at using heat, make sure everything else is dialed first. Have you got the basics right before you start stacking on these 1%ers? Because it could be that your biggest gain could come from 20 minutes more sleep a night, not from 20 minutes added heat stress a day. So yeah, just look at what you're wanting to achieve out of it. And I'd always recommend seek advice from somebody that knows what they're doing on how best to structure it into your training.
Or give us a shout at Team EF Coaching. There's another option.
Exactly.
But no, I think you're right. This is looking at as Nate said, the magnitude of impact. This might not be the most impactful thing to overlay, but it might also be very helpful. So guys, I would like to say thanks for your time. It's been a conversation I've really enjoyed. I've definitely learned more than I came into the show, and I'm sure a lot of listeners will feel exactly the same. So thanks for coming on. Thank you for tuning into the Cycling Performance Podcast. This podcast is produced by myself, Nathan Haas, and Colby Pierce, in association with EF Education and Team EF Coaching, a world leader in cycling coaching for all ages, abilities, and goals. Our world-class team of coaches have won over 100 national titles across all disciplines of cycling, competed in 47 Grand Tours with victories in all 3 and 6 Olympic Games. So it's our goal to distill our experiences to bring you the most cutting-edge approach to cycling to achieve your goals, dreams, and aspirations in our beautiful sport. If you'd like to learn more about Team EF Coaching, find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, or at our website, teamefcoaching.com. We would like to thank Peridur ap Gwyneth from Pendulum for the energetic theme music, and to Ross Hallard, our wonderful editor. Ride in flow, space monkeys.